Welcome to Off Topic Tuesdays, everyone. I had thought about kind of making things up for this video as I went along and just kind of filling in the gaps with my own opinions, but I'll be honest with you. We're going to try and do things straight. Kick back, relax, grab a drink, and let's get into it.
Wow.
So when I first started this video, I didn't think there's a hope in hell that Albion ever shows up, and I would say that's still probably the more probable point, but the more I've delved into this, the more I can actually see Albion making sense. So before we get started, I need to specify Albion as a region actually contains two factions in it. The Truthsayers of Albion, who are essentially good guy druids, and the Dark Emissaries, who are essentially bad guy druids. The latter almost assuredly going to be in the game just simply because they are the army that serves Be'lakor, and Be'lakor, in my eyes, is essentially a guarantee for Game 3. The Truthsayers are a little bit more difficult, but we'll get into a deep dive for them in just a sec. But in my eyes, for a race to exist in Game 3, they have to kind of justify 3 points. One, location. Two, unit roster slash, lords and stuff like that. Like basically making sure they can actually be a faction in the game. And then three, do they make sense in the context of the setting for Game 3? Now, in my eyes, I think the setting will be the end times, not written out exactly as it happens in the tabletop setting where chaos wins and wipes out the world or anything like that, but I think it'll be the general setting in the sense that it will be the kind of vortex campaign of Game 3. And on that front, I think that both factions fulfill those points pretty darn good. All right, so real quick, just before we take a look at the factions themselves, let's take a look at Albion itself. So, on the negative side of things, Albion has a few things against it. One, it will not appear on the Game 3 map. No two ways around that. It's way too far west. It's appeared actually in both Warhammer 1's west side and Warhammer 2's east side. That sort of gives you a bit of a heads up on where it is. Um, that being said, of course, it would still appear in Mortal Empires, no problems there. But even in Mortal Empires, there is another problem with it that needs to be addressed, and that's its size. Um, at the moment, there's at least two things on Albion that we know of: Conquata and somewhere for the Truthsayers to be if they're going to be in the game. The island of Albion is not physically large enough, the way that the game currently has it implemented, to justify two different races being there. What they could do is kind of steal the mechanics that they did for Athel which is super small territories, but with a dramatically slowed down move rate within those territories. This makes a lot of sense in the case of Albion because it's a very swampy, marshy terrain, so movement through it would be dramatically slowed down by default. Now, as for all the things that the island of Albion provides, a lot of the stuff's already been in the game already. So the giants and the Fimir are already in the game as is, and even the druids, as unique as they would have to be. I mean, humans are humans, right? Um, in the case of the Fimir and the giants, there could be some modifications. The Fimir themselves probably would just only go to the Dark Emissaries because I feel like CA's kind of already kind of pegged them as a chaotic faction. You could justify there being good ones. The Femira themselves are not naturally evil, um, but let's reserve them for the Dark Emissaries. The Giants, I would probably put exclusively on the side of good. The Giants on Albion are not like normal Giants. They are somewhat focused on a task. They're slightly more intelligent. They're like, for example, they're capable of using ranged attacks. They would be part of the roster for the Truthsayers. But the real star of the show here are the Fen Beasts. So the Fen Beasts are really the stars of the show here, right? They are unbreakable because they don't feel any pain or anything like that. They would basically have to have a lord available because they collapse into nothingness without someone controlling them. They would probably cause a slight reduction to your own side's Winds of Magic reserve because that's essentially what keeps them up and running. They would probably cause poison or some sort of demoralizing effect because they are essentially full of swamp and rotting corpses. But they're super, super interesting unit. At the heart of each one of them is a very small Ogham stone. The Ogham stones, if you're unfamiliar, are the same stones at the heart of Athel, same stones at the heart of the Vortex. That stuff actually came from Albion, and in a really interesting turn of events, they put those stones into the heart of a unit, and a very interesting one at that. Again, like I said, this would definitely be in both of the rosters, so it gets kind of double duty if CA does decide to put it in there. So let's get to the main event then, that being the factions themselves. So we'll start with the Dark Emissaries because they're a little bit easier to get our heads around. And let's start with the Legendary Lords. So, I mean, assuredly, no doubt about it, one of these will be Be'lakor the Dark Master. He has so much interaction with all the other races in the game, even including Chaos themselves. He is the most prominent character within the entire Dark Emissary story. In fact, he's the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. He makes sense as one. The other one you could do is just grab like a leader of the Dark Emissaries and put him in as a second Legendary Lord option. But again, those would almost assuredly cover your bases for Legendary Lords. So moving down one step to generic lords, the first one's pretty obvious. It would be the Dark Emissaries themselves, right? They would be caster lords of either the Lore of Shadows or the Lore of Death. Just having two different versions of them. They do have a few unique spells, but those could be tossed on essentially as bonus skills as opposed to creating a whole new lore for them or anything like that. They've already got items in the game. They've already got models in the game. Like they're pretty much taken care of. No harm there. The second one's a bit more of a decision to be made by CA if they were going to do it, which would either be the Fimir or an Undivided Chaos Demon. I'm more tempted to say the latter than the former simply because we have tons of Fimir options already and they make more sense a little bit down the roster as a physical character. Whereas a Chaos Demon, we're only going to have so many Demons of Chaos Undivided already. You might as well put them in as a Lord option, which if the Fimir are not going to be Lords, makes sense to slot them down as heroes. Out of all the sort of general three hero archetypes, the Fimir make the most sense as your kind of generic leader slash warrior. Um, it's they're pretty easy to slot in there. Everyone knows what the Fimir act like. The other two slots would kind of have to be made up by CA. So, if you wanted to have like an assassin or a ranged character, I would just create, I don't know, some sort of like bog assassin or swamp assassin or something like that and put them in for that. For lesser sorcerers, that one's pretty easy. Chaos has tons of options for that. Less of a concern there, but there's going to have to be some creative solutions down there. So then finishing out on mounts and the unit roster. Tiers 1 to 2 are probably going to be predominantly weak humans. You could almost kind of look at them as an even weaker version of Norsca. So whereas Norsca still has some pretty hardy guys in it and some decent technological capabilities, Albion ain't got any of that. You're going to have basically unarmored humans without any kind of weaponry apart from perhaps basic clubs and sticks, right? So their humans would probably be very, very weak. Where you could fill in the gaps in tiers 1 and 2 would probably be things like Chaos Hounds and Chaos Beasts. These would essentially be your dog options, but especially in the case of Chaos Beasts, they're actually pretty big. Like, they're almost the size of horses in that case. Those could give you a few options for sort of cavalry-ish units. Moving up to tier 3, of course, things really start to open up there, right? Now you've got things like Fimir available, you have things like the Fen Beasts available. If you move up into tier 4, you're probably going to have even stronger Fen Beasts. You're going to have even stronger Fimir. You can start to justify having some weaker Chaos Demons down there, perhaps like Furies or something like that. And then all the way up at tier 5, you're probably going to start to see Chaos Dragons, and they'd probably have to make up a Chaos Undivided demon there because there isn't really one for Chaos Undivided there. But point being is you've got options as you move up the scales, whereas at the lower end of the scales, there's probably going to have to be a bit of weakness. Would still be kind of fun because it would make them kind of an interesting faction to play as. You'd have almost nothing in the way of ranged combat, kind of like the vampire counts. But unlike the vampire counts, you don't have emotionless undead units. You've got squishy humans who aren't particularly strong. It would be kind of a cool gameplay style. For mounts, you would probably just use the same ones we just discussed. Your bottom mount would probably be a Chaos Beast. Not only does it fit with the aesthetic of the Dark Emissaries very well, but provides a nice quick first starting mount. Moving up off that one would probably be the Fen Beast. Obviously, you'd sacrifice the speed you got from the Chaos Beast, but you'd be significantly more durable and more damaging in that mount. And then you'd finish off on a Chaos Dragon, right? Obviously, quick, can fly, all that kind of shenanigans. Now, as we move over to the Truthsayers, a couple things I want to get off my chest before we get started. One, I am going to do something super heretical, and that is combining the Amazons into the Truthsayers roster. The reason for this is that the Truthsayers or the Amazons don't have a hope in hell at appearing in Game 3 on their own, I don't think. So at least slotting them in together sort of gives them a shot. On top of that, it also expands out their possible locations, and on top of both of those, they also have very complementary rosters. The Truthsayers are full of big tanky monsters and, big slow units and casters, whereas the Amazons are full of small light units and ranged units, which are exactly the two things both factions need from each other. The other thing is, I'm going to be taking some ideas from Matthias Eliasson's homebrew list that he put together. I'll put a link to it down below so you can take a better gander at it. I won't be taking it completely at face value. There's a lot of things I would change out myself, but just credit where credit's due. All right, so for Legendary Lords, somewhat comically, we have more information on giant named characters than we do on Truthsayer named characters. The only one we know of for sure with the Truthsayers is a fella named Charl. He's just an advisor to a Bretonnian lord. Not exactly Legendary Lord material right there. There was a bunch of Legendary Lord suggestions in the homebrew list. I'm not crazy about them myself because at that point I'd rather just have CA make one up. However, we could actually do a Truthsayers of Albion without any Truthsayers of Albion Legendary Lords. So from the Amazon side of things, you could do either Anaconda, who is a incredibly famous character, though she's more typically associated with the Dogs of War, or my own personal favorite, Piranha, who is a ranged character, which would A, make her one of the few ranged legendary lords in the game, and also kind of give her a specific niche, as opposed to my second option, which would be Hengus the Giant. Obviously, he would be a melee option. He would be one of the only giants in the game, as far as I'm aware, that's an actual lord pick. He could be kind of fun because of how different and weird he is. Again, the obvious third option is that CA just makes someone up as a caster lord for the Truthsayers, but there's some fun options on the table already. Moving down to generic lords, I mean, the first one's pretty obvious, that being the Truthsayers themselves. Again, just like the Dark Emissaries, they already have their own tabletop rules, they already have their own items, they already have their own magic spells, which again would probably be slotted over into skills. Um, you know, Pretty obvious caster choice. Moving over to the physical lord choice, I'd probably do the Eagle Warrior from the Amazons. There isn't anything in the lore about generic tabletop lords for the Truthsayers. There was one or a few of them actually, I should say, suggested in the homebrew rules, but again, not really necessary if we're doing a combined roster now, because again, I could just take the Eagle Warrior and slots right in there. For heroes, I would take one from the homebrew list, that being War Chieftains. You could use them as your melee slash, morale boosting hero choice. For your hero caster, this one's become super easy. You just pick the Serpent Priestess from the Amazons. Again, makes perfect sense to take what's already available. And same thing for the assassin slash ranged unit. You would pick the Piranha Warrior, again from the Amazons. That way you're not having to create so much and justify pulling stuff out of thin air. You're just using what's already available. All right, so for units at tier 1, I would just have basic Barbarians as, kind of your tar pit melee unit, and Amazon blowpipe units as your tier 1 ranged unit. I would actually avoid allowing any kind of cavalry or even any kind of dogs for the Truthsayers, specifically to kind of give them a weak point to overcome. I feel like that would make them more interesting. I mean, ordinarily, once you've kind of ground your opponent down, you just send the dogs to chase them as they flee and destroy them, or same thing with cavalry. But taking away that option would actually make you have to focus a bit more and figure out how you're going to accomplish things. All right, so at tier 2, now's where we can start to have a little bit of fun. I would have the Amazon Warriors go in as the damage dealing unit. They would not be durable in any capacity. They'll die in a stand-up fight, but what you would do is tie them up with basically tar pit units and then rush in with the Amazons to claw them all to pieces before they escaped. For the Barbarians of the Truthsayers, I would start to equip them with spears at this level so that they have an anti-large presence on the field. As you would expect, this would be your both your meat shield as well as your anti-large unit to take care of things. And then for the blowpipes, create some sort of more elite version of them that's a little bit more accurate so you can take out a bit more high value targets. Going on to tier 3, I think, which is where things get really, really fun, would be you'd swap out the Amazon warriors for Jaguar warriors. For the blowpipes, I would actually swap them out into some sort of sun launcher, kind of like what the lizardmen have. In the lore, the Amazons actually have access to las pistols, but it really, really doesn't fit in the setting to me. So I would, do exactly what the lizardmen have and kind of old oneify the laser weapons so that they fit into the setting a bit more. Again, I would improve the generic barbarians yet another level and make them even better at anti-large rules. I would also introduce both the fen beasts as well as some sort of cavalry, probably using the cold ones at this tier. That way that you finally have some sort of quick mobility options for dealing with enemy threats. Tier 4 would be where you'd start to lose out on some of your infantry options. I would not allow the damage dealing Amazons to progress up past this point. You could still do one last level of ranged Amazons, perhaps giving them more of like a rifle ranged weapon that still shoots sun lasers. Pew pew. I would also have stopped the Barbarians at this tier. They would not have a tier 4 option. Your Fen Beast, I really like the suggestion on the homebrew list, which was to give them a Fen Hulk option for the Truthsayers, basically just a bigger, badder, stronger Fen Beast. That would be a super fun one. Your Giants would start to come in at this level. Obviously, your Cold ones would become Horned ones at this tier, so you'd have a bit more of an elite cavalry option. And then that would close it off for your tier 4 options. So for tier 5 then, I would basically do the exact opposite as we had for tier 1. So instead of infantry, but no monsters, no cavalry, I would have only monsters, only cavalry, no infantry. I think that kind of twin limitation, at the lower and upper end of your roster could be kind of interesting to plan your builds around, right? So the way I would foresee it is you would have stone thrower giants, which would effectively be bipedal artillery. No different than how the Cyclops are for or Cygors are for the Beastmen. I would have bone grinder giants, which are significantly stronger giants than the default, and significantly larger giants than the default. Um, I would have some sort of Amazon raptors or Amazon, whatever you want to call them, which would be a tier 5 monstrous cavalry, significantly stronger than the cold ones or horned ones were before them, but also a lot lower in number and probably a lot more of a obvious target for your opponent. And then the last thing I would have is some sort of Fen Titan or Fen Colossus or Fen insert big name here, which would essentially be kind of like the Truthsayers version of a Dreadsaurian. Not as powerful, but in the sense that you would have a melee unit that's teaming with ranged weaponry on it so that you can take out enemies that are away from you as well as kick the crap out of them in close quarters combat. I think that would fill out the rest of their roster quite handily and make them a very interesting faction to play as. And these last 3 tiers would also kind of provide your mount options. So tier 3 option, or your first mount option, would be your cold ones, kind of uninspired. I know everyone and their dog already has a cold one mount. Your second mount option would be your Fen Beasts or Fen Hulk, and your third option would be either your Fen Hulk or your Fen Titan. Probably the Fen Hulk, because I think the Fen Titan, or whatever we call it, tier 5 option, would be far too powerful, but could be a kind of interesting option if it was on the table. You could have probably the single most powerful caster unit in the entire game at that point. So I do apologize for the long video. There was a lot of content to get through and I wanted to present sort of how they would present on the tabletop. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that here, right? Whether or not they do show up, well, remains to be seen, but there's definitely some options on the table to put both of these factions into the game, and I really hope CA does give them a fair shake at showing up into the games down the road. For the next Off Topic Tuesdays, I've already got some ideas in mind, but if there's anything in particular you'd like to see, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll try my best. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.